what people don't realize is we look at these diet studies and we see how much lean body mass gets lost versus fat mass. And people don't realize that a lot of this depends on how much body fat you're starting with, and then it changes, the curve changes. So if you're somebody who's overweight or obese, you don't really need to worry about losing too much lean body mass because you have such a reservoir of energy to pull from that your body doesn't really see the need to start pulling from lean body mass. But if you're somebody who's at, and I'll use my caliper measurements for all the internet experts out there, I realize that the numbers I'm going to give you are not the true numbers, but I don't care. It's what I'm I'm just using it as a reference point. I always have to qualify this when I give body fat numbers. So I can go from 15% body fat to 7% body fat, and it's extremely easy. No problems. I lose very minimal lean body mass. From 7% to 5%, now I'm probably losing, 20 to 30% of that weight is lean body mass. When you get down to the shredded area where you're literally trying to squeeze off that last little bit of body fat, you might be losing just as much lean body mass as you are fat mass. So for me, what I would do, and I didn't do this years ago because I didn't even know about this tool, is I actually implement a lot of what's called diet breaks. So those would be periods of eating at maintenance. So basically a level of calories where you're not going to add back fat tissue, but you can eat more than you did previously. So I had pretty good success with this the past year because I dropped 30 pounds. I went up a weight class in powerlifting and then came back down. And so basically I would diet for 2 or 3 weeks pretty aggressively, try to lose like 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds each week. And then I would take 1 or 2 or 3 weeks and eat just at a maintenance level of calories, which for me is about 32, 33, 3,400. And that worked extremely well for me, extremely well for keeping my strength. And so if I was getting ready for a bodybuilding show, I probably wouldn't use those too much if I was like coming down from a higher body fat. But as I would be approaching that lower level of body fat, I would be starting to put these in more and more frequently. So that's why I would give myself so much time, even though I'd only need to drop about maybe 12, 15 pounds from where I'm at right now. I would probably spend more time at maintenance than I did in a deficit, because when you get to those low levels of body fat, the best way I can describe it is like if you have a wet towel. When you start squeezing, water comes out very easily. This is actually almost a perfect example of adipose tissue, because if you take somebody who's overweight, obese, what do you have? You have a lot of free fatty acids getting released into the bloodstream. You have very, very expanded fat tissue. So when you start wringing that rag out, it comes off very easily. But then when you get down to the ends and you're just trying to get that last little bit of water out, to get the same amount of water out, you have to put in monumental levels of effort compared to what you did at the beginning. So I guess that's kind of a huge qualifier of why I'd want so much time to be at my best.
The one thing that you said, Layne, that actually surprised me, and I want to think about this through the lens of some examples, because I thought we could use examples of people, like, kind of people that, hypotheticals or patients of mine. I was surprised that you said going from 15% to 7% body fat could be done without much loss of lean tissue. That is really impressive.
Yeah, for me.
And is that just a function of how hard you're training at the same time? Is that just something that you would attribute to your genetics? Because it's not due to exogenous testosterone, which would obviously be one tool that would enable that kind of lean mass retention.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is it probably depends a lot on what your body fat set point is, or settling point. So for those who aren't familiar, body fat set point theory is essentially that you kind of have this relatively tight range of homeostatic body fat that your body will defend. And once you start to drop below that range, it's really, you really start to feel the negative effects of caloric restriction in terms of your hunger goes up, your BMR drops, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis drops, your libido drops. You start to have those negative side effects. For me, I would say that again, on calipers, that the low end of my body fat set point is probably around 7% and the high end is probably around 11.
And how does that correlate with DEXA for you? Do you know how the caliper numbers correlate with DEXA?
Probably about 3% more on a DEXA, I would say.
So kind of 10 to 14% is your DEXA sweet spot.
Yep. Yeah, something like that.
And in a show, by the way, you're below 4%. Is that what I would infer from what you said earlier?
On calipers, the lowest I've calipered, it was like just over 2% body fat. So
call it 4 to 5% by DEXA, potentially.
Probably maybe 5 or 6, yeah, something like that. And again, that's something I let the internet worry about that, because at the end of the day, it's just about the visual aspect, right?
Although I would guess below that, Layne, because as recently as 10 years ago, I was 7.1% on DEXA. I mean, repeatedly, like 7.1 to 7.8 by DEXA. And I still remember what I looked like then. Nothing like what a bodybuilder looks like. So I would easily believe that by DEXA, a bodybuilder could be 4%.
Possible. I remember, so there was a guy, he's another natural bodybuilder named Alberto Nunez. And if you ever saw pictures of this guy, like I'm talking like veins, visible vascularity in his glutes, right?
Yeah.
So like that level of leanness.
Crazy.
And he went and got a DEXA done. And I remember he was asking people, he's like, what do you think I'm going to be? And people were like, oh, 2%, 3%. And he was 6. On a DEXA.
So the question is then, I'd have to ask, how much of that was visceral versus subcutaneous?
Possible. The other thing is people need to appreciate is the level of error that's in those measurements.
Yeah.
There is an inherent level of error in those measurements.
But yeah, that's counterintuitive for that level of what you describe in terms of vascularity.
Yeah. So who knows? But I think if you are somebody who your body naturally likes to be at a little bit of a higher body fat percentage, you may see some lean body mass loss, at a similar body fat to what I am able to retain more at, right? So now this is me just completely speculating because there's so little data on this, because studies are just so restrictive in terms of what you can actually measure. And I think that this is another point that people don't fully appreciate, is that scientific studies are really big, blunt instruments. Like you are really, if you're doing a scientific study, you're only supposed to modify a couple of variables, if that, because otherwise you just have no idea if what you're observing is due to the variables that you want to test. Otherwise, you might as well just go to observational data. And so when it comes to this kind of stuff, there's so little data out there. And so this kind of is pulling from my opinions based on some randomized control trials I've seen, some case studies I've seen, and some mechanistic data, some animal data, and I always like to tell people when I'm kind of going out on a limb, because I don't want to state it as fact if I'm not sure if it's fact. But I would say that, the differences we see in how much people can retain with lean body mass, I think part of it's due to what their natural body fat set point level is. Because as we exit that lower end of our body fat set point, if the body likes to keep a certain level of body fat, then it makes sense that it might start pulling a little bit more energy from lean tissue compared to fat tissue if it's starting to defend that body fat. Now, there are quite a few things we can do to overcome this, like resistance training, right? Like that's a big one. And I think some of the decrements we see in lean body mass with dieting is, one, a lot of these studies don't do resistance training, or when people are dieting and they're starting to feel worse because they're lower energy, their training volume drops, their training intensity drops, and that's probably part of it. And I think the other thing is too, like, I will say, going from like 15% to 7 on calipers, I did lose some lean body mass, but my relative strength didn't really change. So what's likely is, a lot of people don't realize lean body mass is not the same thing as muscle mass. lean body mass is all non-fat tissues. That's skin, bone, organ weight, all that stuff, and including your body water. And a lot of, I think, what we see with lean body mass loss is water, gut tissue, liver. Those tissues shrink in response to caloric restriction. And so,
yeah, I think most people don't appreciate the glycogen, the amount of glycogen you can lose, and how much water tracks with glycogen. So you lose, let's say you lose half your glycogen volume. You take the mass of that, multiply it by 3 to 4. That's the total mass that's lost given the water as well. Not to mention the plasma loss that comes with plasma contraction.
Yeah, I mean, we see that like in ketogenic diet studies,
right.
like Kevin Hall's study. There was a loss of lean body mass, but even I, me, I'm very critical of zealots in nutrition. And so when I've criticized, ketogenic diet stuff, I've even still said, in this Kevin Hall study, well, most of that is probably water, because if, like you said, if you lose glycogen, you're losing quite a bit of water with that, right?
Well, I wonder if you would agree with an observation that I have found, for which I haven't found data to support, but truthfully, I haven't been on a huge hunt for it, but it's been very empirical for me. So I've gone through various different phases of fasting where I'm doing it for different purposes, right? So I'm not doing it for body composition or anything other than, sort of ramping up autophagy. So basically kind of periodic fasting for health benefits. And the thing that I've noticed is, and let's just use, I would typically do like a 5 to 7 day water only fast each quarter. And what I noticed was, provided I did resistance training every single day during that fast, so I dramatically changed my training because I would normally be alternating between cardio and resistance. But if on those fasting days, the only thing I did was resistance training, and specifically I focused on the biggest lifts possible. So deadlift is my favorite lift. So I would even deadlift every other day and mostly just focus on the biggest muscles. I had to go a lot slower. So I needed much more rest between sets, but I could actually still move the exact same amount of weight. So I didn't get any weaker. It seemed to minimize the loss of lean mass, certainly muscle. I shouldn't say that. I lost water weight, but I did not appear to lose muscle mass. My thinking was that I was at least counterbalancing the effect of mTOR reduction that was coming through the nutrient pathway through a different stimulus. Does that, and again, we're going to talk a lot about mTOR because of course your work in leucine ties right into my interest around nutrient sensing. Does my observation fit with your observations and your experiences?
So I always try to put things in context, right? So I think if you're looking at, losing actual contractile tissue, once you've built it, what it takes to maintain muscle tissue is very minimal compared to what it takes to actually build it. So it does not necessarily surprise me, especially because, this gets into kind of like power of suggestion, placebo, your own personal feelings about stuff, because you view fasting as such a positive that you wouldn't have a reduction in strength because you probably really haven't lost contractile tissue in that period of time. Now, if I take somebody, now it's important to point out that you are I would say a well-trained person, but not somebody who pushes your goal isn't to push the upper limit of hypertrophy. Would I be correct in that?
Absolutely. Nor strength for that matter.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So, and this is where some of the misinterpretations come from what I say to people. So I had this the other day. I'll say, okay, do I think that somebody could build strength, maintain it, doing that sort of thing? Absolutely. A lot of that just boils down to being really consistent with your resistance training. If somebody says to me, I want to be the most muscular, strongest human I possibly can be, do I think that is still the best thing that they could do? No, I do not. But again, it's important to qualify both those things because I realize that one audience, even though I have more of that audience, is a very small specific subsection of the actual number of people. But when I say that, what people hear is, Layne says you can't get strong fasting. And I have to always say, no, that's not what I'm saying. You absolutely can. Do I think that you could get as big and strong doing that as someone who is, consuming nutrients regularly? I don't think so, but we probably will never get a lifelong randomized control trial on that. So I can't say for certain.
Well, actually, I agree with you on that. And in fact, when we turned into the new year this year, I went and got a DEXA scan and looked at myself in January of this year. And I was like, God, I'm kind of amazed over the last decade how much muscle mass I've lost. So on January 4th of this year, I weighed the exact same amount that I weighed 10 years ago in May of 2011. So for all intents and purposes, over a decade, my body weight was unchanged. I'm embarrassed to tell you how much my body fat went up, right? It went from about 7% to 16% over a decade. So you can do the math, right? Like, it's pretty straightforward. Right. I got fatter, I lost muscle. Now, I'm not going to beat myself up too much. A lot has happened in a decade, right? I used to train 4.5 to 5 hours a day. I now train maybe 90 minutes per day. I have very different priorities. My goals are totally different. But, I talked about it with Beth Lewis, who I work with, and I was like, look, and she was like, look, we got to get some more muscle on you, dude. It's kind of getting pathetic. So her first thing was no more fasting for a while, right? That was basically her first suggestion, which is like, we got to take a break from the monthly fasting because that's probably not helping your lean tissue. And if we want that to be a goal, which is there any reason we shouldn't be able to put 5 pounds of muscle on you in the next year? Her view is, I think we can do this, but you can't be fasting every month for 3 to 5 days. So I think that's completely in line with what you're saying, which is an optimization issue. It's, and I've heard you talk about this with respect to plant versus animal protein, and it gets always taken out of context.
Yeah, I just had this discussion the other day.
Yeah. It gets so again. I'll let you state the argument again because you'll probably do a better job stating your own words than I will, stating your words for you.
Yeah. So I kind of had this discussion with somebody who, was saying, well, if you look at the randomized control trials, plant versus animal, it just doesn't make a difference if total protein is equated. And what I've said to people is, okay, I understand that randomized control trials are the gold standard. If we are looking at resistance trained individuals, 8 weeks in terms of looking at actual muscle mass is such a short period of time. Okay. Now I understand my bias is I did work in leucine. I was funded by the egg and dairy councils, all that kind of stuff. So I'm sure any conspiracy theorists out there will have a field day. But I would never tell somebody you can't build muscle with plant protein. Of course you can. Just go look at there's plant-based bodybuilders you can look at who have extremely impressive physique. So obviously you can do it, right? Now, can you build just as much muscle with plant protein? I think you can. However, it's probably going to require more planning on your part and just a little bit more attention to detail because of the factors of limiting amino acids, low leucine content, those sorts of things. Do I think, all things being equal, animal protein is probably a superior form of protein? I do. That being said, that is a small sliver of what actually contributes to hypertrophy. Consistent resistance training and progressive overload is by far the most dominant factor. But we can barely, oftentimes, not even pick out differences. We know volume is important. We know volume, weekly set number is important. We can't even pick out differences in hypertrophy sometimes with different volume protocols. What makes you think we're going to pick out differences in actual hypertrophy in 8 weeks from protein sources where calories and total protein are equated? And so what I've said is, I think the studies are probably a little bit underpowered and shorter on time to actually show the differences we want to show. Now, that being said, I'm not saying they're bad studies. I'm just saying this is a limitation. That's all.
Yeah. So I was going to say that a second ago, but I didn't want to interrupt you when you were talking about the limitations of some of these RCTs. And I was going to add the limitation you just mentioned, which is it's hard enough to control the variables. But the other thing is the tighter you put the grip on controlling the variables, by definition, in a real world, the shorter the study must become. So you look at Kevin Hall's studies. Well, Kevin is doing studies at the highest level that they can be done. So these are patients that are inpatients, and I know this very well. I'm very close friends with Kevin. I have a very clear understanding of how the ward runs, both his ward at NIH and also several others around the country. I've even spent time inside the metabolic chambers personally to experience this. And yeah, we're talking about the highest level of precision inside a chamber that does indirect calorimetry. The reality of it is you can't put somebody in this situation for a year. And so when it comes to going back to exercise, if we think that, you know, the difference in a person over 6 months might be 2 to 3 pounds of muscle mass under perfect conditions, it's going to be very difficult to tease that out in 8 weeks.